All right, welcome to another deep dive. Today we're getting into something, well, it's kind of fundamental if you want to, make sure people understand your English and you want to understand them. Pronunciation. We're going to really dig into the core concepts from a book by Gerald Kelly. It's called How to Teach Pronunciation. Now, we're not going to read the whole thing to you. That wouldn't be a very fun deep dive, would it? Instead, we're going for like a fast track, super interesting look at how we produce and hear speech.
Hmm.
For you, the learner out there, this is all about those light bulb moments, those aha moments that make you go, oh, now I get it.
Exactly. And, Kelly's book, it's really quite a resource. Now, it is admittedly written for teachers, but that doesn't mean it's not full of stuff that anyone interested in pronunciation can use. We're going to pull from all different parts of it. We'll start right at the beginning, how to describe speech sounds. Then we'll move on to how pronunciation actually plays out in, real life conversation. And then, we'll even get into the connection between pronunciation and spelling, which, as we all know in English, can be a bit of a wild ride.
Yeah. A wild ride indeed. Okay, so let's unpack this a bit. For our listeners, for you, the learner, when we're talking about something as huge as pronunciation, where do we even begin? Where's a good starting point?
Well, I'd say the best place to start is with a strong foundation, like building a house. And that means understanding the basic elements of pronunciation. That's where Kelly starts, right in the first chapter, the description of speech. It's in this chapter that we really see the core building blocks laid out. So we have phonemes, and these are like the individual sound units, the tiny pieces of sound that make up words. It's not just individual sounds, though. We also have suprasegmental features. These are things that affect how we say whole words or even groups of words, things like stress and intonation. Then the book goes into the physiology of pronunciation, the mechanics, how our bodies actually make these sounds, and then how we articulate each phone, like what are our tongues and lips doing. Finally, there's a whole discussion about phonetics and phonology, which are essentially the academic disciplines focused on studying these speech sounds. Just to clarify quickly, phonetics, that's the nitty-gritty of how sounds are physically made and heard. Phonology, that looks at the overall sound system of language.
Okay, I'm with you. So phonemes, these are like the core sounds, right? If I'm thinking about it right, they're like the tiny Lego bricks. Swap one out and boom, you've built a whole different word. You mentioned, I think in the intro, rat and rot. One tiny sound change, and it's a totally different word. How many of these little Lego bricks are we playing with in English?
A lot. English has, give or take, around 44 phones, and those include both vowels and consonants, so you have a lot to work with. And for you, the learner, it's important to remember that while we say about 44, the way each phone is pronounced, it can change a little depending on the context, like what sounds are around it, who's saying it, all that. And then we have those, what were they called again? Those suprasegmental features?
Right, the things that go beyond individual sounds.
Yes. This is where it gets really interesting, I think, for anyone learning English, because it adds a whole other layer of meaning on top of the individual sounds themselves, like word stress. Kelly talks about this. Word stress can be the only thing that tells you if a word is a noun or a verb. Classic examples are like import, the thing you're bringing in, versus import, the action of bringing it in. So, paying attention to where you put the emphasis when you learn a new word, that can make all the difference between being understood and, well, not being understood, especially for words like that have a noun and a verb form.
Right, it's all about the emphasis. And sentence stress, that's like shining a spotlight, right, on the key parts of a phrase. So if I were to say, I'd like a cup of herbal tea, putting the emphasis on I lets you know, okay, it's me who wants the tea. But if I stress herbal, that's me being specific about the type of tea.
Precisely. And then we have, of course, intonation. This is the melody, the music of how we speak. And this is something that can turn a simple statement into a question just by, letting your voice rise at the end. It can be really powerful for you, the learner, just focusing on how you use intonation to mark questions. It's a small change, but it can make a big difference in how easily you are understood.
Totally. It's like those subtle cues we pick up on without even realizing it, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so these features, they work together with those phones to like build the whole meaning of what we're saying.
They really do. Moving on to the physiology, how we make these sounds, I always find it kind of amazing to think about all the different parts of your body that are involved. Kelly talks about the larynx. This is that voice box where you have those vocal cords that vibrate when you make voice sounds. You can actually feel it if you put your hand on your throat and say, like a Z sound. And then they stay open for voiceless sounds like an S. And the pitch of your voice, well, that's controlled by these tiny little muscles in the larynx. It's like we all have a musical instrument built right in.
We really do.
Yeah.
And then we shape those raw sounds,
Yeah.
right? Using our tongue, teeth, lips, all those things. Kelly calls them the articulators. And even, your nasal cavity gets involved for some sounds like M and N.
Absolutely. And that takes us to the articulation of those individual sounds, those phones. So vowels, they're generally produced with a pretty open vocal tract, right? And the shape of that vowel sound, it really depends on the position of your tongue, how high it is in your mouth or how low, and then how far forward or back it is. And lip rounding plays a role too. The book even has these diagrams, to show the vowel space. This is really helpful for you, the learner, because understanding that even tiny adjustments in your tongue position or your lips can make the difference between different vowel sounds. That's really key to getting those tricky vowels right.
So like if we think about the sound of like in B, that's a close front vowel, meaning your tongue's high up and toward the front, lips probably a bit spread.
Exactly. Now, consonants, they're a different story. They involve some kind of obstruction of the airflow, like a roadblock. And the book explains that we describe consonants by their manner of articulation. So this is all about how that airflow is stopped or channeled. Is it completely blocked, like with a plosive, like the P sound? Or is it more of a narrow passage where you get that friction, like with a fricative, like an F sound? And then there are nasal sounds, like a mel where the air goes out through your nose. We also classify consonants by their place of articulation. This is where in your mouth that blockage happens. Is it at your lips? We call that bilabial. Teeth, that's dental. Back of the tongue, that's velar. So the book gives the example of P as being a bilabial plosive. Bad because both looks are involved. Plosive because there's that little burst of air when you release the stop. This is really useful because, for you, the learner, if you're struggling with, say, pronouncing words like pen or back, it might be helpful to focus on that release of air, that plosive quality.
Like it's like a mini explosion of air.
Exactly.
So much detail, even for just one sound. Okay, there's also phonetic transcription, which is touched on in the book. This is kind of like a secret code for pronunciation, right?
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. You see all those symbols, and it can seem a little intimidating at first, but it's really useful. Phonetic transcription uses a specific set of symbols to represent those speech sounds, those phones, in a consistent way. This is especially helpful for English because, as we all know, English spelling, it doesn't always play fair, does it? Like, think about words like cough, bow, rough, and though. They all have that off at the end, but 4 completely different vowel sounds. Phonetic transcription, it cuts through all that mess and gives you a reliable way to see how words are actually pronounced.
Okay, I'm starting to see how useful that could be. So we've got a handle on the basic components of speech, right? Now, I got to ask, for you, the learner, why is it so important to really focus on pronunciation? I mean, isn't this something we kind of just pick up naturally as we go?
Well, we do acquire our first language pronunciation naturally, that's true, but consciously paying attention to it and even having some explicit instruction. It can be really important, especially when you're learning a second language like English. And, Kelly emphasizes this in the book. Clear pronunciation, it's just essential if you want to communicate effectively. I mean, mispronunciation can sometimes lead to misunderstandings, which can be really frustrating for everyone involved. Even if you manage to eventually get your meaning across, it can still be a bit, awkward.
Yeah, that makes sense. If someone's constantly mispronouncing words, it can definitely get in the way of getting your message across. The book does mention that pronunciation can be a bit of a challenge to teach and learn. Why is that? What makes it so tricky?
There's a few things, actually. So you, as a learner, might have certain pronunciation habits that you've carried over from your first language, and those can sometimes interfere with making those English sounds correctly. Or sometimes, pronunciation just hasn't been given a lot of attention in language classes, or you might just feel a bit self-conscious about really focusing on how you sound. But Kelly really makes the point that working on pronunciation effectively, it requires a good understanding of the theory behind it, knowing how things work. And then you need practical techniques, engaging activities.
It seems like the approach to teaching pronunciation has kind of shifted over time, too. The book mentions this idea of received pronunciation, RP, that sort of classic British accent, and how it's becoming maybe less of a central focus. What's the thinking now? Like, which pronunciation model is really the most useful for learners these days?
That's a good point. You're right. RP, which you might associate with a more formal style of speaking, it's not really seen as the only model to aim for anymore. The world's a much more connected place now. The book really advocates for a more, I guess you could say, inclusive approach, one that focuses on developing a good understanding of English pronunciation in a broader sense, acknowledging that there's just huge variation in accents regionally, internationally. The goal for you, the learner, should be intelligibility. That means being able to understand a range of accents and speak in a way that a range of people can understand.
I like that, intelligibility.
Hmm.
So the goal isn't to make everyone sound exactly the same, but rather to give you the tools to communicate clearly with, well, with anyone who speaks English. Okay, let's get practical. What does the book suggest in terms of actually working on your pronunciation?
Well, it's packed with practical ideas, actually. One of the most fundamental techniques, and this might sound simple, is repetition, often called drilling in the teaching world. Repeating sounds, words, phrases over and over. You can do this in different ways, like, building up a sentence gradually, adding a word at a time. Another really useful tool, and I think this is a good one for learners, is working with what we call minimal pairs. These are words that differ by just one single sound, like ship and sheep. Practicing these can really help you train your ear to hear those subtle differences and train your mouth to make them correctly. Kelly also suggests using your existing English knowledge as a starting point. Focus on listening activities where you're really paying attention to those specific sounds and use things like phonetic charts to help you visualize how the sounds are made.
I remember when I was learning languages, minimal pairs were really helpful for like really honing in on those tricky sounds that can change the whole meaning. Okay, so we've talked about the sounds themselves and some ways to practice them. Let's look at the actual sounds of English a bit more closely, starting with vowels. Now, the book talks about pure vowels and diphthongs. What's the difference, and why is it important for learners to understand this?
Right, so pure vowels, sometimes called monophthongs, are those lovely vowel sounds where the position of your tongue and mouth, it pretty much stays the same throughout the sound. Like think about the vowel in sit or the one in father. Diphthongs, on the other hand, these involve a sort of glide. Your tongue moves from one position to another, but all within the same syllable. So like the E in cake or the E in kite, these are good examples of diphthongs. The book goes into lots of detail about describing each vowel sound, based on tongue height and all that. And it often uses those vowel charts, those diagrams, which can be really helpful for visualizing where those sounds are made.
Those charts, yeah, they're great for getting a visual. Like, okay, this is where in my mouth this sound is coming from. So the I bead, that's a close front vowel, meaning the tongue's high up and towards the front of the mouth. And diphthongs, like that E in cake, they start in one vowel position and then kind of move towards another. So how can you, the learner, become more aware of these different vowel sounds?
I'd say a key thing is to really pay attention to what you're physically doing when you make the sound. Where is your tongue? What are your lips doing? Is your jaw moving? Those vowel charts we were talking about, they can help you see how the sounds relate to each other, which can be useful. And of course, practicing those minimal pairs, finding words that contrast those vowel sounds you're working on, that can really help you train both your ear and your mouth to distinguish and produce them accurately.
Makes sense. It seems like vowels can be especially tricky for English learners. Are there any particular difficulties with vowels that you see come up a lot?
Oh, absolutely. One very common challenge is that the vowel sounds in English, they might not have exact matches in your first language. So what often happens is you'll substitute a sound that's close, that's familiar, but even a small difference in the vowel sound, it can change the meaning in English. Vowel length is another tricky one. In English, the difference between a short vowel like the idem bit and a long vowel like the izine beat, that can be really significant for meaning. And then there are just, those tiny subtle differences between vowel sounds that might sound very similar to you at first. Those can be hard to both hear and produce correctly.
Okay, let's move on to consonants. Now, the book really breaks them down, doesn't it? It talks about voicing, which is whether your vocal cords are vibrating or not, then a place of articulation, where in your mouth the sound is made, and manner of articulation, how the air is released or restricted. Can you talk about how understanding these characteristics can help someone who's learning English?
For sure. So knowing whether a consonant is voiced, like a B where your vocal cords vibrate, or voiceless, like a P where they don't, that can help you with both hearing and producing those sounds correctly. Then, understanding place of articulation. This is all about, are you using your lips? Is your tongue touching your teeth, or are you using the back of your tongue? It gives you a kind of physical anchor for making the sound. And manner of articulation, this is about how the sound is released. Is it a sudden burst of air, a continuous stream? Is the air coming out your nose? This helps you control the sound. And Kelly, he's included this really great table in the book. It basically summarizes all the English consonant phones, and it lists these characteristics for each one. It can be a really handy reference for anyone learning English.
So if we take a sound like in the word thin, We could describe it as a voiceless dental fricative.
Hmm.
Voiceless because there's no vibration in your vocal cords, dental because your tongue is lightly between your teeth, and fricative because there's that constant airflow creating a bit of friction. It's amazing how much information goes into just one sound.
It really is. And I think for you, the learner, when you encounter a new consonant sound, consciously thinking about these three things, the voicing, place, and manner, it can really help you get a handle on the pronunciation. And of course, just like with vowels, those techniques we mentioned, they apply here too. Pay attention to how the sounds are made, use phonetic charts, and practice those minimal pairs, like thin and sin in this case, to really focus on the differences.
Are there any specific consonant sounds that English learners tend to find particularly challenging?
Oh yeah, for sure. So some English consonants simply don't exist in other languages, and those can be really tough to master. Like and A sounds, the sounds, they're tricky for a lot of learners. And even if a sound exists in your first language, there might be small differences in how it's pronounced in English. And those tiny variations can be hard to get right. Consonant clusters, these are those groups of consonants without a vowel in between, like street or friend. Those can also be pretty challenging to pronounce clearly.
Yeah, those clusters can be real tongue twisters. All right, let's move on to another really important feature that shapes the way English sounds, and that's stress. Kelly's book dives into both word stress and sentence stress. What's the key takeaway here for learners?
Well, word stress is all about which syllable within a word gets the most emphasis. And in English, well, let's just say it's not always predictable from the spelling. But there are some patterns that can be helpful to learn. For example, in the word banana, the stress is on the second syllable. Sentence stress, this is about which words in a whole sentence get more emphasis. And generally, it's the words that carry the most meaning. So nouns, verbs, adjectives, adverbs, they tend to be stressed more than those little grammatical words like articles and prepositions. For you, the learner, really paying attention to stress both at the word level and the sentence level, it's essential if you want to sound natural and be easily understood.
So word stress, it's like the internal rhythm of a word. And sentence stress, it's like the rhythm of a whole phrase, showing you where the important bits are. Now, what about those parts of words that don't get stressed? The book talks about unstressed syllables and weak forms.
Ah, yes. So in English, those unstressed syllables, they often get reduced. This means the vowel sound gets shorter and less clear, sometimes even changing to that neutral schwa sound, the tro sound. Function words, those little words like a, the, of, to, they very often have these weak forms when they're not stressed. So the a in a cup of tea, it's usually pronounced as a schwa. Understanding these weak forms, it can really make a difference for you, the learner, when you're listening to natural, fast-paced English.
It's like the little words kind of fade into the background when they're not carrying the key information. The book also mentions something about rules and levels of stress. Are there any hard and fast rules for word stress that learners can rely on?
Well, English wouldn't be English without its exceptions, so no hard and fast rules that apply in every single case, but there are definitely some tendencies and patterns that can help. For example, words ending in certain suffixes often have the stress on the syllable right before the suffix, and prefixes, those bits at the beginning of words, they usually don't carry the main stress. Kelly also talks about how words can actually have different levels of stress. There's the primary stress, which is the strongest, then a secondary stress, which is a bit weaker, and then those unstressed syllables. Learning these common patterns, it can be really beneficial.
So it's about looking for those patterns and tendencies, even if there isn't always a rule. And then in sentences, there's that idea of the tonic syllable. We've talked about it a bit already, but can you explain what it is and why it's so important?
Yeah, so the tonic syllable, it's like the superstar of the sentence. It's the syllable that carries the main stress, the emphasis. And usually it's the syllable that carries the most important information, the bit that the speaker really wants to get across. Often it's the last content word in a sentence, the last noun, verb, adjective, or adverb. But it can shift depending on what the speaker wants to emphasize. Recognizing the tonic syllable when you're listening, that's a really useful skill for you, the learner, because it helps you grab the main point of what's being said, even if you don't catch every single word.
Right, it helps you follow the thread of the conversation. Okay, so how can you become more aware of stress in both words and sentences? Are there any tips for that?
Lots of things you can try. The book has some great suggestions. For example, you can actually physically show the stress. Use hand gestures that move upwards on the stressed syllable, or try tapping out the rhythm of words. It might feel a bit silly at first, but it really works. When you're learning new vocabulary, try to make a note of where the stress falls in the word. And of course, really listening to how native speakers use stress, that's invaluable. You can even try, writing down how you hear the stress patterns. It's a great exercise.
So it's about being active, listening, experimenting, and, not being afraid to get a little physical with it.
Mm-hmm.
All right, let's move on to what I think is one of the most fascinating aspects of pronunciation, intonation. Now, the book makes it clear that intonation is not just about, raising your voice at the end of a question.
Mm-hmm.
What else is going on there? What does it really communicate?
Oh, you're absolutely right. Intonation, that rise and fall of the voice, it can convey so much more than just whether something is a question. It can show your attitude, your emotions. It can even help structure a whole conversation.
So a rising intonation at the end of a sentence, yeah, it can turn a statement into a question. But what else?
It can also express uncertainty or even politeness, like if you're asking for a favor, and then a falling intonation, which is more typical for statements, that can show finality or certainty. It's really fascinating, actually, how much meaning is packed into those subtle changes in our voices.
It really is. And the book uses these terms, tones, the tonic syllable again, and tone units. How do all those fit together to create those melodies we hear?
Right. So when we analyze intonation, we often look at what we call tones. A tone is basically the direction of your pitch movement on a stressed syllable. Does it go up? Does it go down? Does it do a little bit of both? These tones usually happen on that all-important tonic syllable, the most prominent one in a chunk of speech. And those chunks are what we call tone units. A tone unit, it's essentially a meaningful piece of speech that often has a little pause before or after it. A whole sentence can be made up of one or more tone units.
I'm seeing how it all builds up. Intonation, it's also connected to grammar in English, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. You'll find there are often typical intonation patterns that go with different grammatical structures. For example, think about yes-no questions. They often have that rising tone at the end on that last stressed syllable. But why questions, those ones that start with who, what, where, they tend to have a falling tone. And statements, commands, they usually have a falling tone as well. Recognizing these patterns, this can be super helpful for you, the learner, because it can help you anticipate what kind of information is coming next.
It's like there's this hidden layer of meaning being communicated through intonation. And of course, our emotions come through in our intonation too.
All the time. Your emotional state, how you feel about something, it can be expressed through these really subtle shifts in pitch. A sudden jump up in pitch that might show surprise. A slow falling pitch could show you're disappointed. And sarcasm, well, that often relies heavily on using an intonation pattern that's the opposite of what the words literally mean. And of course, for you, the learner, consciously learning to control and vary your intonation, that can make your English sound much more natural, much more expressive.
It's like adding that extra layer of, authenticity. The book also talks about how intonation helps us to structure a conversation, showing what's new information and what's already been talked about.
Right, so speakers use intonation to kind of guide the listener. New information often gets a more noticeable change in pitch, while stuff that's already known or less important might have a flatter intonation. It's really interesting, actually. And, intonation might seem like a very subtle and complex part of language, but Kelly argues that with practice and focused listening, those key patterns, they're definitely learnable.
Okay, so we've talked about individual sounds, stress patterns, and intonation. And now the book dives into this area called other aspects of connected speech. What does that cover, and why is it important for English learners to know about this?
Right. So connected speech, it's a really key idea. It basically describes how pronunciation changes when we're speaking naturally, fluently. It's not just about pronouncing each word in isolation, it's how those words flow together. And understanding these features, it can make a big difference in your listening comprehension. And it can help you speak more smoothly and naturally. So the book talks about several things that happen when we connect our speech.
Okay, give us an example. What about, assimilation?
Yeah, assimilation, that's a big one. This is when a sound changes to become more similar to a sound that's next to it. A classic example is, in books. Often when we say that phrase naturally, it sounds more like in books. That's because the N sound at the end of in changes to an M sound to match the B at the beginning of books. It just makes it easier to say.
Our mouths are efficient, aren't they?
Yeah.
They like to find the easiest way.
They do.
What about elision?
So elision is when a sound completely disappears. It gets swallowed up in the flow of speech. Often it's a weak vowel or a consonant in a cluster that gets dropped to make things smoother and faster, like next day. You often hear that pronounced as next day.
Yeah.
That chat just vanishes.
I do that all the time.
We all do.
Okay, what about linking and intrusion? I've always been fascinated by those. It's like sounds magically appearing and disappearing.
They are pretty cool. So linking is when a sound at the end of one word joins onto the beginning of the next word. A common example is when a word ends in a vowel sound and the next one begins with a vowel. You might hear a little bridge sound inserted to make it flow better, like go out. It often sounds like go wout, almost like a W sound between the words. Intrusion, that's when an extra sound pops up between words. It might be a J, a W, or even an R. It's not really part of either word. It's just there to help the words flow together smoothly. A really common example is the intrusive R. You hear it a lot in phrases like law and order, which can end up sounding like law and order.
Right. And there's also juncture, which is all about those pauses, and then, of course, all those shortened forms we use all the time, those contractions.
Yes, exactly. Juncture, it refers to the pauses and breaks we naturally make when we speak. They can be really subtle, but sometimes they can actually change the meaning of what we're saying. And contractions, I mean, these are super common in spoken English. Don't, can't. They definitely affect how we pronounce those combined words.
So, for the English learner out there, becoming aware of all these features of connected speech, it can really make a big difference, not only in understanding others, but in sounding more natural and fluent yourself.
I completely agree.
Okay, let's wrap up by talking about that sometimes frustrating relationship between, well, how words are spoken and how they're written. Pronunciation and spelling. We all know right from the start that English spelling, it's not always the most reliable guide to pronunciation. What are some things that you, the learner, should keep in mind when it comes to this whole pronunciation versus spelling thing?
Well, I think the most fundamental thing to remember, and Kelly makes this clear from the outset, is that English spelling, it just isn't consistently phonetic. There's no one-to-one match, letter to sound. The same letter can be pronounced in all sorts of ways, and the same sound can be spelled using all sorts of different combinations of letters. And I'm sure you've encountered this countless times, right?
Oh, countless times. I mean, we started with this. Words like cough, bow, rough, and though. Same off, but 4 completely different vowel sounds. It's enough to make your head spin.
Exactly. But here's the thing. Despite all this, shall we say, unpredictability, Kelly does point out that there are some recurring patterns, especially with suffixes and certain letter combinations. But I think one of the pitfalls for learners is that they might try to pronounce words exactly as they're spelled, which, as we know, can often lead to errors.
So how do you suggest learners approach this? How can they navigate these spelling minefields?
Well, I think a key thing is to become familiar with those common spelling patterns and the different ways that certain letters and letter combinations are typically pronounced. And at the same time, you have to be aware of the exceptions. And this is where that phonetic transcription we talked about earlier can be so helpful, because it gives you that visual representation of how the word is actually spoken, no matter how crazy the spelling might be. The book has some good examples of these spelling patterns and the sounds they typically represent, and it also talks about common pronunciation problems for speakers of different languages. It even gets into those tricky silent letters and those letters that have, different flavors, meaning they can be pronounced in different ways depending on the word they're in.
So it's about developing strategies for dealing with those inconsistencies, right?
Right.
Because English spelling, it's not always going to be your friend.
That's a good way to put it.
Well, we have covered a lot of ground in this deep dive into pronunciation using Gerald Kelly's book as our guide. For you, the listener, what would you say are the most important takeaways?
I think the key thing to remember is that pronunciation is a multifaceted skill. It's complex. It's not just about getting individual sounds right. It's also about understanding and using stress and intonation. And then, all those ways that words connect in natural speech, that's super important too. Both for understanding others and for sounding natural yourself. Having a basic grasp of how sounds are produced, that can be really helpful. And I think realizing that English spelling, well, it has a mind of its own. That's really important for figuring out good learning strategies.
So pronunciation, it's not just one thing. It's a whole system of interconnected things. We've looked at how sounds are made, how stress works at the word and sentence level, and how that music of our speech, the intonation, plays a huge role in how we communicate. And then there's that added challenge of English spelling, which sometimes seems to have a life of its own. Expert,